aren't signing in, and I have no way of knowing whether or not you were here. And as a consequence of that, I might be compelled to file a CARES report or something when I don't have to, and I hate doing that, but they're telling us that we really must do that. So I'm kind of resisting that as much as I can, but you can help me avoid that by letting me know that you're here. Right? All right, now today we're going to move on to this discussion of this concept of the nation state. But before we do, we covered quite a bit of ground on Monday's class with respect to culture, and I'm wondering if anyone had any follow-up comments on that or any questions or anything like that before we move on. Sounds like not. So I'm going to assume then that everyone's pretty comfortable with that. I can tell you that not everyone has read the reading, and so that's not a good thing. I will say again that it's really not a very good strategy. If you want to do well in the class, it is not a very good strategy to wait till the last minute to look at these readings well after they've been discussed. It's really better to take a look at them before we discuss them. And I mean that quite literally, just take a look. You don't have to read from top to bottom. Some of these things like the culture entry are fairly extensive. And they're articles that I might use even in an upper division class, but we can do a flyover of those for a class like 250, where there are just a couple of key concepts that I want you to think about. So as long as you have those, you're fine. All right, then I'm going to move on to our discussion of this global system of nation states, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this notion of a nation state means. If you have a question, unless you have a microphone that doesn't work, it's better if you just blurt it out. But Patricia has a question.
There's something weird going on with my screen. That's why I have mine turned off. But I read the intro on culture, and it was, to me, very convoluted, and it just confused me more, because it's like I never found a direct answer to it, because there were opinions about this and that, and I don't know, I felt really confused after I read it.
Okay, well, that's all right. It's okay at this stage of the game if you feel a certain amount of confusion. The whole point of that article is to caution us about, and this is what I was trying to talk about on Monday, we think we know these terms. We throw them around all the time as though we knew what they mean, and we don't. So the idea here is, really be considered in the way that you use these terms. When you use culture, essentially what it's saying is, a common thing to do in academia, if you're going to use a term for which there are potentially confusing alternative definitions, the one thing that you can do that will really save the reader a lot of trouble is say something like, for purposes of this analysis, the term culture is meant here to imply this, and then offer the reader a definition. Because what that says to other scholars is, okay, if you don't buy my definition of culture, then you're going to have to rethink this thing. This isn't maybe going to help you with the study of culture you're doing. But it's the idea that almost nothing that is interesting is simple in terms of concepts. They really are all, anything involving human beings that's interesting is complicated and confusing. So it's okay if you feel a little bit of confusion, or you see a little more complication than you thought. That's okay. That means you're in the process of learning something. So I understand it's a little bit frustrating, but on balance, it is a good way to learn, where your mind kind of wanders for a while, and pretty much it'll latch on to something eventually. That's when you're, and it is that capacity of human beings for pattern recognition. It really is an amazing capacity. It's one thing that computers don't do very well, but we do. And there's nothing on the planet that does it better than humans, and at such a sophisticated level. As a consequence of that, though, Patricia and others, we find ourselves looking for connections where they might not exist, okay? And that's where we can get into these situations where we kind of abuse these terms by using them improperly. I'm seeing that a lot in this term in my upper division 399 class. It's it's empire and decolonization. And there are a lot of students who have these assumptions that are just baked into their brains about, most of them very negative toward the United States and things like that. And most of that is ignorance. It really is. And we have to be honest about that, and I mean, I can say I'm satisfied with the fact that, like among my family, I'm the only one with a graduate degree. And that was a big accomplishment because my people like me weren't supposed to get graduate degrees. And I'm happy about that. But you know what it doesn't say? It doesn't say that I have absolutely no ignorance left. There's a lot of things about which I'm ignorant, and I keep looking. I'm curious. So it's because what I'm trying to do is prepare you, since this is a lower division class, to prepare you for when you encounter the ambivalence of some of these concepts. Maybe you'll have a better way to think through them. Not that there's a right or wrong answer, but that you might be able to resolve a concept in your mind, at least sufficiently so that you can make use of it. So that's why, yeah, there will be some confusion. I wouldn't ask you, by the way, for just a simple cut and dry definition of culture, because that would fly in the face of everything that we're learning here. But I might ask you, explain to me what the complications are in trying to define culture. What are some different ways that we can think about the term culture? That I think would be more useful than thinking, what is the one singular definition of culture that we all must use? Does that make sense? Okay. One thing I meant to remind you of before I started recording, but maybe it's just as well that I do it now. Some of you are encountering problems with Zoom. Okay. You're trying to, the most common seems to be you're trying to get into a session and you get bounced out again and again and again. I talked to Brady Hogan in IT, and he is one of the most helpful tech people I've ever worked with. Okay. And he seems to think that a lot of those problems might be resolved if you upgrade to the latest version of Zoom. And I was having a problem with file compatibility when I was trying to save files so that I could upload them to YouTube. Beyond a certain point, I couldn't do it properly. A file became corrupt because I hadn't upgraded to the very latest version of Zoom. Okay, because remember, this stuff is encoded too. And indeed, to some extent, it's encrypted even. So if you're having trouble with that, you might try going to the Zoom site. I think it's just zoom.com, and there will be a download of whatever the latest version of Zoom is. Okay, and there should be for any smart device or PC or whatever that you're working with. Most of you, I think, are probably working with either a phone or a pad. I think that's right. So if you're having a problem with that, that might be the case. All right. Anything else on culture? All right, then let's move along. This idea of a nation state is another one that's something like culture. There's not an easy answer here. And so what I thought I would do today, not so much to just summarize the reading, but maybe to help you understand the reading and help you interpret it, is talk a little bit about the separate concepts of nation and state, and then how they sometimes are fused together into a nation state. Okay, because the thing about these kinds of concepts is most of you, for example, will think of a nation state as a political thing. It's like, well, that's politics, and I'm not interested in politics. What I'm trying in a class like this to introduce you to are the ways in which all these different concepts inevitably do combine. If you're talking about politics, you can't just talk about politics. You have to talk about culture, and you have to talk about identity, and you have to talk about government, and you have to talk about, you have to talk about territory, and you have to talk about law, and you have to talk about a lot of different things, not all of which may seem to be explicitly political, okay? Because again, my background is primarily political, but this is not a political science class. This is an introduction to the interdisciplinary program of international relations. And so what you're going to see a lot of times are these fusions of concepts. The concept, for example, of ruling class is very complex because it combines essentially political and economic terms. Ruling implies politics. Class implies economics. But by fusing those together into this concept of a ruling class, which is primarily a Marxist concept, right? what Marx is trying to tell you, and the authors who use that, is the best way to understand how power works in this particular terms of order, this particular society, whatever, is that those who control the means of production control social reproduction. They control the way that institutions work. They control the outcome of elections. They control these things because they rule on the basis, not because they're rich, but because they control how things are produced. In other words, they don't just own stock in a factory, they control it. All right. They don't just influence workers, they pay their salaries. And so as a consequence of that, they rule. That's that political economic fusion. Well, nation state is something like that, okay? And so if we look at the concept of a nation, when you hear the term nation, what do you normally think of?
Country.
Apparently, most of you get very meditative when you hear the term nation. Tremendous amount of introspection.
Well, I agree with whoever said, I mean, country, just like in the simplest of terms. Like when you bring up that, that's the first thing that pops into my head.
All right. So then when I use the term country, what do you think of?
That would then be, shoot, like a region that's all governed by, you know, one type of power, whether it be, you know, I don't know.
Then it sounds like, Kennedy, like what you're saying is, if a nation is a country, then a country is about territoriality. You can't have a nation without territory. Is that right?
That's what I think.
Okay. Is that what everyone thinks? Do we have consensus? Can we move on? Okay, you're wrong. How about that? And of course, I don't literally mean you're wrong. I mean, that is not the only nor necessarily the most illuminating way to define nation. Typically, when you're talking about a nation, you're not talking about territory. It can be involved in that, but what you're really talking about is a community. And it's a community of sufficient size that it stands out as not just like a neighborhood, but we're talking about a community that is stable. So first of all, you have this stable community, okay, that's unified by sharing all those things we talked about with culture, right? A common language or a common history, identity, and territory can be a variable in that. That is, we all live in this place and we all, you know, we speak this language and we have this common shared history and this common shared historical experience, and we express it in a culture within which we all live. That's normally the way the term nation is indicated. That is, you can have a nation that isn't a country. If you think, for example, about when people talk about, you know, the history of Native Americans, and they talk about the whole notion of indigenes in America before Europeans came, they are often referred to as nations, usually because they're larger and more expansive than the concept of tribe, which usually implies something more localized. And also some people think the word tribe has a kind of negative connotation to it, that it implies a kind of primitivism or something like that. I'm not sure that's accurate, but that's sometimes the concern. So people will use the term nation, okay? But it's hard to say that any but very few of the stable communities in pre-European America were locked into specific fixed territories. They tended to roam. They tended to follow game. They tended to look for food. They tended to forage. You know, they tended to do a lot of things. Now, some did settle and establish, cities or towns or whatever you don't want to call them. Okay, but normally the notion of nation implies a shared identity that characterizes a stable community. So if you think about it that way, a shared identity that characterizes a stable community, okay, then all of a sudden, it's a little easier to connect that to some of the assumptions we have about culture. That maybe a culture is part of the glue that holds that nation together as a stable community. The shared language and the shared values and the shared historical experience and those kinds of things, okay? That's normally what we mean when we say nation. Now, it doesn't mean that it's an apolitical term, that it has nothing to do with politics. But what I'm trying to suggest is that unlike something like country, which implies juridical boundaries, which is explicitly political, nation doesn't imply that. Okay, you can have, for example, a situation like the Horn of Africa, where you have people who identify as Somali, okay, ethnically, but they live in different provinces and states. Some of them live in Somalia, some of them live in disputed provinces like the Oromo, some of them might live in Ethiopia or Eritrea, but they consider themselves part of a unified nation, or part of a cohesive, relatively historically stable nation. They speak languages that that are not indigenous, say, to Ethiopia or Eritrea or wherever in the Horn of Africa, right? But they consider themselves, you know, cohesive and stable as a community. They identify as Somali, okay? They don't identify on the basis of where they live necessarily, right? If their stronger sense of identity is that notion of the national identity of being Somali, okay, that's nation. If their origins are Somali, whether in Oromo or, you know, Somalia or wherever, and then they say they move to the United States, or they move to Australia, or they move to Ethiopia, and then they consider themselves to be Ethiopians, or they become Ethiopian citizens and think that way, then the sense of nation is weakened. They don't feel as strong a tie to nation. There's a notion in the study of ethnicity, okay, you know, ethnic studies, ethnic politics, and it's called primordial ties. Okay, and it means these are ties that unify people together before the creation of modern political divisions, of the modern state, and you know, the modern national architecture of our maps and things like that. That before those, primordial, before the established order, there were these ties, and those ties are almost always ties of shared history and historical experience, shared language. Some people say shared ethnicity, which is kind of that, shared culture. Okay, so think of nation as involving more a sense of shared experience, articulated through language, through customs, you know, and things like that. It can have a territorial component of it, but nations typically do transcend territory. Okay. Also, most modern countries have multiple nations or nationalities within them. The United States is a classic example of that. I mean, American's not really a nationality. It's a political identity as much as anything else, in the sense that we're talking about. Because we know, for example, from our discussions of culture, there are surprisingly few things that unify all Americans together. We're a much more complex society than that. Now, one of them is the English language as spoken by Americans. Now, we talked about regional accents and perhaps dialects and things like that. Those are the primordial remnants of old primordial ties. Okay, they're still with us. Okay. I mean, if you think about a term, an international term, you know, like Creole, okay. The original notion of Creole was someone who came from a European country, usually Spain or Portugal, someone who came from there as a colonizer, right? And then they had children who were born in the colonial territory, but they were still ancestrally European. They were referred to as Creole. The more common modern usage of that is someone of mixed race living in those territories, okay? So these terms evolve over time. But what they do involve is some sense of there is a primordial tie that's complicated by the mixing of cultures, the mixing of histories. You know, when we talk about someone as being, for want of a better term, it's a dumb term, but we use the term mixed race, okay? First of all, race is a largely meaningless term in anything that calls itself scientific. Okay, it's almost more an emotional term than it is anything else. But properly understood, what it's talking about is primordial ties. Okay, what it's really talking about is more of a sense of nation, of a shared identity, a shared historical experience. And when you mix that, think about Barack Obama, okay? Because Barack Obama had a not a unique but a peculiar history for an American. That's like, this is that sort of diversity we talk about, right? In other words, he had a father whose heritage was East African, but also Muslim. His mother was white, which is a fairly generic term that can mean a lot of different things. All right. And we've already had a couple of people talk here about multiplicities of identity in terms of whiteness, that there is no such thing as a white culture. Okay. So what's happened is you have people who have really, they have the remnants of multiple national identities. They have some, in some ways they can empathize with or identify with something other, maybe even than the identity that they appear to be to other people. This is one of the complexities of identity that we'll have to deal with, not only in this class, but you'll have to deal with in your lives as America becomes increasingly sort of, for want of a better term, again, multiracial or multi-ethnic. Is pretty soon it's not going to mean much to talk about people as being black or white or whatever. It's not going to mean much. It really doesn't mean all that much right now. But what does mean something is the experiences that people share as a consequence of the way they are perceived by others. Part of identity is that. Part of identity, in terms of national identity, is the commonalities that you see in those around you that you don't see in others. In other words, it's a sense of shared identity. But part of shared experience that can also be characteristic of nation is being the outsider. Think about being Jewish, for example. Okay, we normally don't think of a Jewish nation. Now, we know there's a Jewish state, Israel, right? But, I mean, there are more Jews living in New York than there are living in Israel, okay? Now, some Jews, in America, for example, have very strong ties to Israel. There are what some people describe as Zionist. They believe in a Jewish homeland and Jewish state, a territory that is by and for Jews. Okay. But even the notion of what it means to be a Jew is complex. This gets back to Patricia's apparent confusion over the term culture. Well, look at the notion of being Jewish. Well, that can mean a lot of things. In other words, you may or may not observe holidays. You may or may not go to shul. You may or may not go to synagogue. You may or may not think of yourself as an Orthodox Jew or a conservative Jew. You might be a Reformed Jew, or you might be a secular Jew, right? You might be a non-practicing Jew, okay? But there is some sense that you still have that some part of your identity is Jewish, okay? That comes from two sources. It comes from the historical experience that you share with other people who identify as Jewish. It also comes from the way that you are identified, perceived, and sort of cataloged and named by others. Does this make sense? In other words, this happens kind of coming and going, And some of you may have encountered this in many ways, where at various times you've been mistaken for something other than what you see yourself to be. Okay. So this notion of nation then is complex, and it's subtle and can be confusing, in part because it involves culture. But think of it as both a sense of shared identity, and shared experience, but also the experience that you have in being identified as one of them as opposed to one of us. That can reinforce a sense of nation or national identity. And it's most common in really, I would argue, two things, because those are the two things that are most readily accessible to the people around you. One of them is the way you look, and the other one is the way you speak. Okay? So this notion of nation then, think about stable community. There is a political component to national identity because it can exert a strong influence on things like people's attitudes about law, people's attitudes about policy, and people's attitudes about authority. Okay, that's a good point. Patricia points out another misconception of being Jewish is being a race. Okay, most people, particularly most practicing Jews, right, And that is people who really identify as Jews or observant, what are sometimes called observant Jews, will say, we are the Jewish people, okay? And, or they might say it's an ethnicity. In other words, I'm ethnically Jewish, meaning, you know, I come, at least from my mother's side, I come from Jews, and that's that's a blood tie, right? But you might say I'm ethnically Jewish, but I'm not a practicing Jew. That is, you might say, you know, I don't observe the holidays, or, you know, I like Christmas, or what, I mean, whatever it is, you know. A lot of Jews in the United States are more or less kind of quasi-observant or secular Jews, but they may still identify very strongly as ethnically Jewish, okay? And by the way, keep in mind that well into the 1950s in the United States, segregation applied to Jews too. Okay, in other words, it took a long time. Companies were routinely sort of fairly relentlessly anti-Semitic a lot of times. And so there was a concept of what was called a show Jew, where if you wanted to have a better sort of public facing image in a company, you would hire someone who you felt, and this is honest, who you felt looked Jewish, and they would be you could say, yes, we hire Jews, and then not hire any more Jews. And there was also something called a gentleman's agreement about whether or not Jews would be allowed to advance in companies, or what kinds of positions of authority they'd be able to hold. You know, why have we never had a Jewish president? Why have we had so few Jewish Supreme Court justices? Especially when you consider how many Jews go into the profession of law in the United States. Why have we had so many Jews on the Supreme Court? You know, well, part of that is a vestige of another national identity, okay? And that is essentially an Anglo-Saxon, sort of a patrician identity of sort of the, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, for example, as being the founding people of the United States. Never mind that that doesn't quite fit. That is a part of the American national identity, okay? Because again, the assumption is there are shared experiences, there's a shared language that's mutually intelligible, however many weird expressions, or however we may or may not flatten our vowels or anything else, I can, other than in Boston, I can more or less understand what you're saying, you know. All right, so any questions generally on nation? I would recommend that if you're confused about that, you can very easily just Google the term nation. That's where Wikipedia is your friend, okay? But what I'm trying to encourage you to do, I don't want to just give you answers and say, listen, if you want to pass my class, remember that a nation is this. The process of learning here for you is much more valuable if you take on some responsibility for that and think, I need to think through this. I need to see what my understanding of nation is. And remember, it's not your opinion. That won't hold up. You can't just decide for academic purposes, well, when I say nation, I mean this, and I don't care if it means what anybody else means or not, because you're not helping anybody. You're not adding to an existing body of knowledge, because you've reshaped the term so completely that we might not be able to use it anymore. So one of the ways that we can do that in this magical 21st century is you can just Google it. And there are some pretty good online entries that help you. They kind of walk you through the various notions of what a nation is. Okay, and national identity. Think of it in terms of identity. There are other forms of identity. Okay, but think about what would distinguish a national identity from, say, an identity derived from sexuality, right? Or an identity derived from, you know, being a small person in a big world or something like that. I mean, those are different kinds of identity. The other thing that you'll find with identity is that all of us really, when we stop to think of it, have these cross-cutting identities. We're all multiple identities, okay? I mean, there's a certain identity that I'm gonna have because I'm male and I'm, you know, more or less, I would say probably about 70% white. You know, but I also look white. In fact, the older I get, the whiter I look, which is really kind of creepy. But what are you going to do? You know, this is nature's way. But all those are identities. But then there are these notions of identity, these vestiges of identity that someone like me is going to have because of the way I grew up. Okay, so that, yeah, I might show up demographically as white, lower middle class or something like that as a kid. But when you looked at where I lived, it's like, oh, wait a minute, look at, he's hanging around with a lot of people who are nothing like white middle class people. And you have a different experience as a consequence of that, which yields a different identity. Okay. Zachary a couple of times has mentioned this notion of a kind of Scandinavian heritage, a kind of Norse identity, and the Viking image and things like that. Those are shared historical experiences that characterize an identity. Now, see, unlike Zachary, I have no connection to that at all. For one thing, all of my people are tiny. Most of them were incredibly violent. A lot of them came from Portugal as whalers and learned how to knife fight at a young age. Others grew up, in among the Nez Perce and all that. So there's this kind of indigenous American identity. And yet I'm not Native American and I'm not Portuguese, but they're there. You see what I'm saying? In other words, they're part of my experience. There's this multiplicity of experiences that in sum total yield your sense of identity. Okay? Does that make sense? And again, if you disagree with that, that's okay. I'm just saying, is what I'm saying sensible? Okay, because this notion of identity is very complicated, and the worst thing we can do is try and simplify it. I think that's where Americans run into a lot of problems, is that we spend too much time trying to simplify things. Just tell me what it means. No, it's not that easy. You got to try it on and walk around with it a little bit. I'll give you a funny example, okay, and then we'll move on. This shows you how complex this can be. One of the few people on this planet who really knows me well is my older sister, okay? And because there's a thing that happens with older sisters and younger brothers, where older sisters can be very territorial and very protective. And especially when we lived in places that were really violent, she was always looking out for me, and she knew a lot of really hard-ass guys, and she would say, you better watch out for my brother, And so they would kind of have my back, right? So she goes to the California State Fair. This was about 15, 20 years ago, right? And she sees this. Now, this is going to sound racist, but it's not. You'd have to know my sister. She sees this T-shirt that says, it's a black thing. You wouldn't understand. And she buys it and gives it to me. Okay? Now, a lot of people were really stunned by that. They were especially stunned when I showed up at a gig wearing that shirt. Okay? And a couple of people were offended. But what my sister meant was, in a way, it was her way of acknowledging, you lived such a weird life that you developed or enhanced this sense of empathy that you have, where you do kind of understand. Without claiming ownership of an identity, you kind of get it. And it was because, in large part, I wasn't that concerned with my own identity. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is, identity can be really ephemeral. It can be really kind of, I thought I had it and then it went away. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I don't think you should judge that morally. You just should understand that identity is complicated. I also think it can be really unpleasant and not very rewarding if you cling to an identity because you think it gives you a sense of worth. Okay? That is, gee, I wouldn't be anything except that at least I can claim this identity. That's not a very comfortable way to live. Because what you're doing is you're diminishing those things that you bring to the table that might have nothing to do specifically with identity, but might have to do with capability. Okay. So just some things to think about with the notion of nation in terms of its functional performance as a revealer of identity and a maintainer of identity. Any questions on nation then, generally speaking, as I refill my coffee? Everybody's very quiet today. Now that either means you're getting it or it means I'm boring you, but you have to let me know. It's one of the weird things about Zoom is I don't get that same connection that I get when I'm in a classroom.
I do have a question, not with what we're talking about, but at least with, I don't know how you go about these kinds of lectures in person as compared to, like, I don't know, maybe this is kind of off topic, but
that's all right.
I think also, like, at least for me, I'm a bit more of a visual person, and at least like within lectures and whatnot, there are professors who, they make use of whiteboards or whatever it is to then like write down those like kind of like main topics.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's completely, from one person to the other, and how they choose to teach and whatnot. But I was just wondering how much it has changed for you, like your way of teaching and like getting through.
I would say not at all.
Not at all.
The only thing I miss is it's not funny anymore. It used to be really funny. I like being in the class because I think it's funny, and this isn't very funny. I mean, I might be more prone in something like this to use a whiteboard. I found when I tried in spring to use it and it was really clunky, and I asked people, what do you think, should I use it? And they're like, no, it breaks the flow. But what I'm trying to do, and what I do sort of teaching in person as well, is to repeat a concept as though I had written it down to emphasize it, if that makes any sense. But no, I like to be, I generally work without notes because I know what I'm going to say. But I find that it's a more interesting experience if it's more improvisational. That is, if it's not just like, let me read you from my notes and you write this down. I find that to be an impediment to learning. It is not an impediment to remembering, but remembering isn't necessarily learning. And what I'm trying to do, and Kennedy, it's a fair point, and a lot of people hate the way I teach. Okay, they hate it because they're in the back of their mind, they're saying to themselves, screaming to themselves, just tell me what I need to know to get through this class. And yet I don't do that. And I haven't done it in 30 years of teaching because I don't believe that's learning. I think that's indoctrination, and I'm not going to do it. Now, it means that some people are not going to want to take classes from me. I accept that. That's fine. That's okay. But I have found that this particular method of kind of controlled chaos does generate thinking because it compels you to think. It's like, wait a minute, I got to think about what he's saying here. I'm going to make a note about this, but I got to think about this because he thinks he's onto something. Let me see if he is. You're more likely to be compelled to think if I'm not just saying, okay, write this down. Now, if you're in the sciences or something where if you're taking chemistry, you just have to memorize the periodic table. There's no other way to do that. There really isn't. And I've talked to chemistry professors and I said, come on, how do you make the periodic table sing? How do you make it funny? You don't. Okay, I'm sorry, But with me, it's like, no, this is human stuff. This is social stuff. This is walking around breaking things kind of stuff. And you should be able to make that sing by improvising. But it demands more, I think it demands more of students. It does. And so again, a lot of students, you may not like that. A lot of students may not like that. But I don't teach to be liked. I take it I don't take myself, you must be able to tell, I don't take myself very seriously, but I really take seriously what I'm doing in here. It's just that it's not as fun in some ways as it is when I'm in a classroom and there's more of a sense of exchange and all that. But, I can't fix that right now. I can't do that. And as I say, I tried the whiteboard thing in spring and everyone hated it because it was just, people couldn't read it,
It's no, I mean, because there is going to be that disconnect with the remote kind of thing that's never going to be, it can never be replicated as much as you try, and so then it's more of a thing of just dealing with it. So
yeah, but it's why, again, what I try to do, at least verbally, rhetorically, is say, okay, I'll ask over and over again, does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Okay. I find that's more useful because it's more likely to compel people to listen. I think one of the things that's a risk here, especially now as I look here, almost everyone has the screen shut off. I have no idea if you're listening or not. I don't even know if you're still here. Okay. And so the idea is I'm teaching to the people I can see.
Okay.
And if they're listening, they'll either have questions because they're listening and something doesn't make sense, or they won't have questions because they're listening and everything more or less makes sense. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And that's an interesting insight. And I do think a lot. In fact, I was just on the phone this morning talking with someone about, somebody was asking me, what do you do differently now that you can't be in the class? Because it was a student of mine 20 years ago and was asking me, well, you can't do those things that you used to do in class. I'm like, no, I can't because there's no reaction. It's like, how many of you watch I almost said Jon Stewart, John Oliver on HBO. See, he was really hot with students about 5 years ago, but I don't think enough of you watch Oliver anymore. Okay. He used to do that in front of a live audience. He is essentially a kind of a comic writer who also is politically very astute and individually very brilliant. And he does a lot of political analysis. He's one of the few people I've seen who has made that transition, that sort of pandemic era transition, to doing what he does cold with no response. And you can see sometimes where he just wants something to lean into a little bit and there's no response, there's no feedback. An important component of teaching for me has always been, you're in the wild, you're in this classroom with these belligerent human beings who hate what you're doing and don't want to be there, and you have to be a lion tamer. You know what it reminds me of, really? Breaking up bar fights. As a little guy, breaking up bar fights. Because, I spent way too much time in bars between the ages of about probably 18 and 27 before I went to college. And because that's where you work, that's where you make music. And for some reason, I was always the guy who had to break up fights. So these two big giant dinosaurs would start going at each other. And I'd say, all right, now lads, that's enough of that, And I was so tiny that they'd probably kill the guy. I guess maybe we should stop. It was probably like, they probably looked at me as just like this pathetic little guy, but they stopped fighting. It's lion tamer, I'm telling you. I don't get to do that here. There's not that sense of dynamic, encounter. And I do miss that. All right. So the notion of nation, that's pretty good. The notion of nation, write that down. Here, write this down. Stable community, very important. A stable community whose stability depends upon culture, what we talked about with culture, which includes things like language, identity, customs, values, and can involve a sense of being connected to territory. It's not uncommon for a nation to exist and identify with a territory, but that nation can transcend the limits of what we would recognize as that territory, which becomes much more relevant when we move toward the development of the modern state. So the next thing we need to talk about is, what is a state? Okay. Now for this one, I'm going to give you a definition. Okay, and this is a definition. When I was in graduate school, I had to write a professor's book for him. That's how I made a living. He wanted to put a book out and he couldn't write for shit, so I wrote his book. And I think I got $700. Something like that. You just need money when you're in graduate school. You'll do anything, All right, and it is this. Okay, I'm going to take this one slow. Imagine a whiteboard. All right. Here's a definition of the state that we can begin with. Do you know what a nexus is? First of all, you college people. Who knows what a nexus is? Somebody, come on, you've got smart devices. Look it up. This is college. What's an NEXUS?
Nothing, because it was a shampoo I used to use.
Okay, so a shampoo, a state is a shampoo. We know that.
Yeah.
This says a connection or series of connections linking two or more things.
Excellent. A series of connections. So when I use a series of connections, or of course, a shampoo. All right. A nexus of authoritative institutions. Authoritative institutions. So the connections, all the connections of authoritative institutions that exert control over a given people living in a legally bounded territory. So I'm going to do that again because this one I do kind of want you to get. And again, this is not the only or best definition. I had no idea that nexus was so popular. I never used it. All right. The nexus of authoritative institutions exerting control. I actually had to write this down. Over a given people living in a legally bounded territory. And we'll break that down into its moving parts, notwithstanding shampoo. Now, does anybody need me to repeat any of that?
Yeah, can you do it one more time?
Sure, yes, I absolutely can. a nexus of authoritative shampoo, right? Of authoritative institutions, a nexus of authoritative institutions exerting control over a given people living in a legally bounded territory. Okay, does anybody need it again? Okay, good. One of the reasons I did that is because my experience in, for the better part of 30 years teaching political science, students really struggle, American students in particular, really struggle with the concept of the state. Because for Americans living in a federal system, which we live under, we think of the state as like the state of Oregon. And when we think of the state of Oregon, it's kind of like what Kennedy was saying about nation. Well, it's like a country. And well, kind of, but not, that's the thing. But the state in this sense isn't the people. Okay, this is in the modern sort of technical European sense of the state. The state is the authoritative institutions that govern those people. Okay, so in other words, the state involves a number of integrated institutions, this notion of a nexus of institutions. So the given constitution of a state legally, all right? Oregon as a state has a constitution. The Constitution is sort of the blueprint for the terms of order politically in the state of Oregon. This is how political power is going to work in the state of Oregon. This is how we're going to do elections. This is how we're going to make our laws. These are the things we can do. These are the things we can't do. Okay, that's the Constitution, the way that power is constituted in a territory. Part of what makes Oregon a territory, and more importantly, a legally bounded territory, is the idea that borders have been established that are recognized as legal both within Oregon and beyond Oregon. No one, for the most part, disputes the borders of the state of Oregon. When you leave Oregon, you're told you're leaving Oregon. Don't come back. Okay. Now you're in Washington. We're more sophisticated than what you just came from. Okay. And we have baseball and you have not, or whatever. Okay. We have many things that you have not if we're in the state of Washington. We also have, higher incidence of COVID. So that's because we're part of the Pacific Rim. All right. So that is, you have this territory with recognized boundaries. There happen to be people living there. Whether or not they're permanent residents, they live there now. They're right there right now. Okay. The state is the apparatus of governance that covers all of that. Okay. In other words, if I go down, I'm not going to go this weekend, but maybe next weekend, I got to go down and see my dad, right? Dude's 96 and he's still cranking. It's amazing. All he's doing is shrinking. It's really interesting. When I do that, I will leave the state, the authority of the state of Oregon, and go into a different juridically bounded territory, California. Okay. And I will immediately fall under the jurisdiction of the state of California. I am now, even though I'm not a resident of California, I'm subject to the laws of California. Okay. This is why the state is important as distinct from the people. I'm the same person driving along in my Toyota Yaris, listening to anything but reggae, But California says, okay, now we got you. Right? Now you're ours. And you're ours until you leave. And there might be, this was really important, for example, when Oregon decriminalized marijuana before California did, and then legalized medical marijuana before California did. One of the things a lot of people weren't picking up on is when you cross the border, that's a different state. And under that state authority, you can't have that stuff. And you can be stopped and it can be taken away. Yeah, Cassidy.
Okay, I don't know if this is a dumb question,
There's
but
no such thing.
I mean, be careful. But how can weed be legal like here and in California? I know Montana's voting on legalizing weed. And so on the state level, it can be legal, but on the federal level, it's still like criminalized or whatever. Sometimes
Go
it's
ahead.
not.
That's not a dumb question at all.
Okay, perfect. Because I
No,
was just sitting here thinking, and I was like, how does that work and function within
Actually,
the
the
state?
easy answer to how does it work and function? Really well, thank you very much. You know, it does. It works well because this is what the purpose of. That's a great question, though. It's not only is it not a dumb question, it's a great question because it deals with something that a lot of people have trouble thinking about. Remember when we were talking about identity? And I said, think of it, that can be a multiplicity of things that contribute to your individual identity. You can have multiple identities as, you know, in terms of your sexuality, your ethnicity, maybe you're multiply linguistic, you know, you speak multiple languages or something. All those are elements of identity. Well, in terms of the state, that is that nexus of authority, what we decided at the founding of the republic was this is going to be a federal republic. We didn't just do it because we were trying to be nice or interesting or historical. We did it because we were trying to get buy-in from the individual states. Okay, come on, ratify this Constitution because we're trying to save the national American economy. We won't be able to do that if we don't unify as a nation with an integrated economy. But what we will do, states, will leave you with a lot of your own authority. Okay? And so that's why, no, that is a brilliant question. That's where I want the thinking to go is, wait a minute, what if you have multiple state authorities? Aha, then you have something called federalism. Yeah.
Okay, so kind of to follow up on that, there was a time period in Montana where they didn't have like speed limits because they're crackheads, right? And the federal government was like, you won't be receiving funds unless you install that, right?
Yes.
So could the federal government just be like, actually, we don't want any of you guys to have weed at all and like be able to like revoke that? Or how would that work?
Yes, they could.
That's kind of tight.
No, it's not kind of tight. It's federalism. Okay, because the idea here's what people, the other side of that people aren't thinking about is under 2 presidential administrations now, the federal government has done next to nothing about interdiction of marijuana. That's actually a good thing, okay, because they're leaving it to the states to sort it out in large part because one of the things we're finding now is the more that we and I'm not an advocate for pot. It's one of the reasons why reggae bores me, but the idea is if you decriminalize it, I'm not going to have to kill you for it. You know, like, I mean, you know, it's kind of funny that the only thing you can really say about pot is that it makes people more boring than they normally are. And, you know, yes, should that be criminal? Yes, it should. Being boring should be a crime, but not a capital crime. All right. And let's just leave it to the states to decide what they're going to do about boring. Because if you're in the Midwest, boring's probably a good thing. You know, right? But if you're in California, boring is down. It's not a healthy thing. It's kind of like the behavioral equivalent of reggae. It's just not a good idea. Okay. It doesn't work. It ceases to function. Okay. But the kind of maybe inadvertent genius of federalism is, you know what? Let's see how the states sort this thing out. Because the consequences of getting it wrong so far haven't really seemed that. It's not like we're talking about legalizing heroin, okay? And we're not talking about legalizing murder. In fact, if anything, we're trying to reduce the incidence of murder related to people doing the business of illegal drug transactions. I mean, keep in mind when I remember vividly, never mind why, being 13 and realizing if I get caught with a joint, it's 2 years in California Youth Authority. Okay. California Youth Authority was gladiator school. Okay. It was not a nice place. No one was interested in rehabilitating you. People were interested in doing harm to you. Okay. And just for having a joint, 2 years in YA. Okay. Nobody's doing that anymore. It's ridiculous. I remember going to Nevada. We catch you with pot, 20 years. 20 years. You know, I mean, the idea is, you see how there are different, the states did it differently. Gradually, states are figuring out, you know, kind of like we did with prohibition during the Depression. You know, we can figure this out. We can figure this out. That is, you know, we got to give the people something. Let's give them back some beer. Well, you're going to have to give them more than beer. All right, screw it. Let's get rid of prohibition. Okay. That was a combination of what was going on under the nexus of authority at the state level, the individual states, and the broader nexus of authority that was national. Okay. So see, you know, Cassidy, really, and I'm not, you know, like kissing your ass. It's like, that's the kind of question that can stimulate a really interesting discussion because it demonstrates the complexity of the concept of the state. Well, how does the state work? Well, sometimes it doesn't work very well. You know, why not? Well, maybe federalism doesn't work everywhere. If you look at different countries, for example, if you look just at England, not as Great Britain, but England is not federal. Okay. But if you look at Britain, you have divisions of authority. There's an Irish parliament. Okay. There's a Scottish parliament, but they're all part of Great Britain. Okay. And so that's a kind of multiplicity of states integrated into a federation. Then there's the broader notion of the British Commonwealth. Okay. And to be in the Commonwealth is sort of like we recognize and respect the authority of the monarch, but we're not bound by the British Parliament. Okay. 10 Downing Street can't tell us what to do. It just can't. Okay. So no, that's good. That's the complexity of the state. All right. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because I don't think you can really make sense of the term nation state unless you have at least a running start at thinking about nation as a kind of identity and state as a kind of authority. That's the whole purpose of what I'm doing here. So if I had Kennedy, if I had my whiteboard, I'd put identity and authority and say nation state. And I'm not making fun of you. I'm just saying if that I would write down. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Anytime you want to pop that out, I will take it.
But so does that make sense? In other words, okay, when we're talking about nation state, we're talking about the integration of identity and authority. How do those work? Well, sometimes they work really well. Sometimes they don't work well at all, and we have war. Okay. Now, if you look at the article on the nation state, again, it's kind of like, and it's going to invoke the same concerns that Patricia had with the discussion of culture, all right? Right away, author's going to tell you, you know, there's not a general agreement on exactly what a nation state is or which came first, the nation or the state. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. We're not here to solve that dilemma right now. If a bunch of people who are, you know, have PhDs and, you know, are boring to drink with can't figure out what a nation state is, we don't need to worry about it. We're better than that, you know. But what we can think about is how can I think about the concept of nation state? Because you know what, Bill's kind of suggesting to me that if I take international studies as a major, all right, I'm going to run into this stuff again. I'm either going to run into discussions of nation, nationality, and national identity, or I'm going to run into dilemmas of the state and governance and authority. And I'm going to get that stuff. So why don't I figure it out right now? I'm going to learn more about it and I may refine that, you know, but I'm just trying to give you that running start at thinking about something that fuses identity with authority, with legal, juridically bounded authority. There's a concept of the state that makes a lot of people very nervous. Okay. And it would be, if you took the definition of the state that I gave you, okay, and after a legally bounded authority, you added exercising a monopoly of coercive violence. That's a sociological definition developed by a really brilliant sociologist by the name of Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, right? Because Germans sound cooler than we do when they say W's. They call them the V's, you know. And what he's saying is an important component, an indispensable component of that nexus of authority is the monopoly of coercive violence. You cannot survive and keep a state alive and functioning if the people have more control over coercive violence than the state itself. Okay? That's a modern bureaucratic notion of what the state is. And indeed, the modern notions of the state are very much bureaucratic. These agencies, when I talked about authoritative institutions, think of them as bureaucracies. And they're regulatory bureaucracies. There are redistributive bureaucracies. There are repressive bureaucracies, okay? And they're all kind of integrated into this authority that we recognize as the state, okay? To the degree that the people living in that state, or at least let's say a critical mass of them, share a common sense of identity, we can talk about a nation state, okay? Now, we don't always have that. And I'm gonna let you go in a minute, because I found that I think I mentioned this before, if I keep you much more than an hour, everyone starts to sort of fall off your bike. But one of the most interesting places I ever spent any time, and it was also probably the single most dangerous place I've ever been, was under a military dictatorship in Nigeria back in 1989 under Ibrahim Babangida. The thing about Nigeria that really intrigued me, other than that it was interesting to try to do research and attend graduate seminars and things in a military dictatorship, and have to walk that line, as ultimately I did not do very well, is there was a real sense of it being a multinational territory with a lot of animosities between the significant identities or nations. That, in other words, there were multiple nations embodied within Nigeria, and the state was constantly struggling to reconcile that. It wasn't harmonious at all. It was acrimonious. I mean, when Nigeria experienced a civil war, the trigger for that civil war, and it was a bloody civil war that you will recognize as the Biafran Civil War if you encounter it in history. I mean, it's one of the things that I remember from my childhood because of images of starving children in Biafra. The notion of it was almost like, this is going to sound really heartless, but kids are pretty heartless. When someone looked sick, we'd say they looked Biafran. And what we meant it wasn't racist. It was the idea that you look like you're dying, and that's how bad that war was. You know what triggered it? A census. Trying to determine how many of what kind of people live in northern Nigeria, which is largely Islamic and connected more with Arab-speaking North Africa than it is with sub-Saharan Africa. In the south is largely Yoruba, right, who had their own kingdom. They had their own sort of ethnic tradition as children of Odudwa and a lot of other things. And then to the southeast were the Igbo, right? And the Igbo had distinct, mutually unintelligible language, culture, identity, rank system within society. Everything was different. And they fought and fought and fought and fought. I mean, they butchered each other, okay? Part of that was a legacy of colonialism and the idea that an artificial state was created by the colonial empire, by Britain, forcing together into the same juridical territory under the same nexus of authority, these really disparate national identities. Okay, does this make sense, by the way? And to see that in action and to see the violence of it and the constant sense of vulnerability, and then to see the capricious authority of the soldiers in the military, for example, to see someone shot so that a soldier could get on a bus, you shoot them and get them out of the way, and realize, done, I'm not taking that bus. To realize, by the way, that being white wasn't going to help you. It just created a problem, but it was a problem that was easy to solve, okay? That's a consequence of a disharmony that undermines the authority of the state, in part because of the tensions that are inherent in these conflicting national identities. So this notion of nation state really implies that somehow you've reconciled the contradictions of multiple identities. You've allowed to emerge a kind of singular identity, by the way, typically created, right? Because there has been a shared historical experience, for example, in what we call America. Now that shared historical experience isn't the same for everybody, but we reinforce the sense of shared historical experience in the United States through public education. That's one of the most important functions of public education, to build and maintain nationalism. It's really an important consequence of having K through 12 education. Everyone's supposed to be getting the same narrative. What we come to find is a lot of that narrative is nonsense. Okay, but we don't usually discover that till we get into college, and most Americans don't go to college. So, there you go. So that's the notion of nation state, is that problematic fusion of a prevailing identity, sense of us within a juridically bounded territory presided over by this nexus of authority, okay, the state. Identity, authority, okay? Now, ultimately, as you advance in your education, you may find a better way to define it. That's fine. What I'm trying to do is give you enough to be going on with so that when we use a term like nation state, it will make more sense to you. Okay. Now, are there questions on that? I feel like I've kind of overloaded you, but when you allow this to distill a little bit, I think it'll make some sense. Okay, again, a reminder for those of you who may be having trouble either with this class or other classes where you get as far as the waiting room but can't be admitted to a Zoom session, try upgrading to the most recent version of Zoom on whatever device you're using. That tends to iron out a lot of those problems. If not, please let me know, because then I can go back to IT, or I can connect you to IT and maybe they can help you. So I'm running into just a couple of students who are really having trouble with that, and I want to see what I can do about that. Okay, anything else before I let you go? Okay, grading is going very slowly because I'm simultaneously grading 3 different classes and doing a lot of administrative stuff. Those are not excuses. There is no excuse. Those are explanations that you deserve because I'm not returning your assignments as quickly as I'd like to. As I mentioned before, if you're concerned about it, let me know. I'll push you to the front of the queue and I'll give you at least a provisional grade. I don't want you to worry about it though, okay? I mean, about more than half of my 399 class has to rewrite their midterms. That's to be worried about. You don't have to do that, okay? All right then, we're done for the week. I would ask that you do 2 things before Monday. One of them is review the reading on culture, review the reading on nation states, and any notes you've taken, and please bring any questions that you have that occur to you after we get offline so that I can address those in class. And then I'd like you to take a look at this article on what's called cultural nationalism in the context of what we've already talked about and trying to figure out what a culture is, what a nation is, and what a nation state is. What's cultural nationalism? All right? Otherwise, have a good weekend, and I will see you all, hopefully see you all on Monday. Okay? All right.
Bye.